You're listening to the Biz News Power Hour, brought to you by the team at biznews.com. Gigi Alcock is with us on the day after the unemployment figures for South Africa were released, showing horrific numbers. But Gigi, we've spoken about this a number of times in the past, and I'd like to get some context on unemployment and the numbers and the way they're put together. Before we go there, though, just to introduce you to those who haven't met you before, you're a marketer, the author of Kasinomics and the Kasinomics Revolution, a speaker, an entrepreneur, and someone who really specializes in letting the rest of us understand how the informal market operates in South Africa. When you see this data coming out of Stats SA, the unemployment figures showing, world-leading numbers on the wrong side, what goes through your head?
Alec, look, I mean, first of all, we have to differentiate, but define how we measure unemployment. And one of the big problems with the numbers that we see is that it says unemployment. It doesn't say formal unemployment, and actually it needs to say that, because a lot of anything outside of someone who earns a pay slip is in essence not measured by those numbers. I saw an article this morning by Mike Schussler where he kept referring to formal unemployment, and he's spot on, because if you don't have a pay slip, if you're not formally employed, if you're in the informal sector, this is not measured. So while I think it's a tragedy and it's terrible that formal employment or formal unemployment is so high, it's not a true reflection of our entire unemployment, and I must add other forms of income generating activities. And a simple one, as an example that I've referred to in the past, is, for instance, rental, primarily backroom rental, which is a 20 billion rand a year sector in the townships and rural areas. So that's money that people are earning who may be formally unemployed and informally unemployed, but are still earning income through other activities, and that kind of stuff is not measured in our numbers.
Just tell us about Kasinomics, a nutshell, the books that you've written, and what motivated you to focus on this area.
So the underlying principle of it is that there's a massive economy that is an invisible or informal or unmeasured economy that sits in informal sector, and that informal sector is not called it Kasinomics, because I don't like the concept of informal, because it implies unsophisticated, small scale, low tech, disorganized, and so on, which of course the informal economy is not. And so I created the term Kasinomics, which refers to the township, but purely as a term to define, move away from the informal economy. And the concept of Kasinomics is in essence that within our inner cities, within our rural areas, within our townships, and even around us in the suburbs, there's a huge informal economy, or an unmeasured economy, that is not only huge in terms of large numbers of people and large numbers of small businesses, but huge in amounts of turnover that many of these businesses are turning over. And those sectors, just in a kind of thumbnail, is the Spaza sector is a 150 billion rand sector with 100,000 outlets. The fast food, or what I call Kasiko sector, is a 90 billion rand, 50,000 outlet sector. The hair salon sector is 10 billion rand. The muti sector, traditional herbal medicine, is a 19 billion rand sector with 150,000 people employed in it. And many others, so and could be the construction sector, the taxi sector, 250,000 taxis, 50 billion rand a year. There's others like the auto sector, so like Gasi panel beaters, mechanics, and so on. It's about 80,000 people. Then there's the rental sector. The as I mentioned, backroom rental is worth about 20 billion rand a year. Over and above the residential backroom rental, the spaza sector that I mentioned primarily rents, and there's another 25 billion rand in rental that's earned by spazas, particularly immigrant or foreign spaza owners renting from South Africans. So you add all of this up, and you've got a fairly substantial sector. Recently, FNB breathlessly announced informal sector or cash economy far larger than ever thought, and mentioned wholesalers in the kind of broadly spaza sector doing about kind of 40 million rand a month as an example. I've written about fast food outlets doing 50,000 rand a day plus, and so on. So there's this huge sector that's there. It's an unsupported sector in terms of support from government, from the formal corporate sector, be it financial institutions and so on. Bylaws, in essence, are created to undermine the sector and. But in essence, we have this huge sector, and to a large extent, this sector sustains livelihoods, incomes, employs people, pays people, primarily in cash. And it's an unmeasured sector, particularly when it comes to unemployment. And my argument is that real unemployment pre-COVID would have been closer to 10 to 12% based on estimating these sectors. And probably now, I mean, it's hard to say because, the formal unemployment has grown, but parallel to that, a large number of indicators are showing that the informal sector has grown as the formal sector has been pummeled by COVID lockdowns and so on, because a number of reasons. One of them is that a lot of the informal sector is residentially based. So if your hair salon is a container in your front yard or a back room, it's a hawker on a street corner, and so on and so forth. And so that sector has, in essence, not been as badly affected. But we've also seen a lot of growth of that sector. The Joburg Fresh project. Yeah.
People are just, you're saying people are hustling. I mean, people are actually getting at it and making a living. But those numbers that you quoted earlier are huge figures. Where do you get them from? How do you calculate them? Or are they just a good guess?
Oh, sure. I wish they were good guesses. In fact, when FNB brought out the article, I said on LinkedIn, they should have read my book in 2014, and they would have discovered the sector. And they didn't have to discover it in
7 years later.
So it's a lifetime of work in that space. I had a leading marketing business in that space, and there's a number of ways of measuring that kind of turnover. For instance, 150 billion rand spaza sector is not only my figures, it's correlated by other businesses like Trade Intelligence and other industry leaders. There's other ways of measuring it. For instance, if you just look at the hawker sector, particularly fruit and vegetables, there's 18 municipal markets in South Africa. The Joburg Fresh Produce Market is one of the largest. It does about 6 billion rand a year with 20,000 customers. Those 20,000 customers, 60% of them are informal traders. So just imagine the impact on the agricultural sector of that. And in a recent article by one of the larger agencies in the fresh produce market, they showed over unrest how the formal sector supermarkets had literally fallen off the map, and the informal sector hawkers and spazarettes and so on had actually picked this up, and they were quoting real numbers. I mean, so it's not thumbsucks and stuff. Some of it may be a little bit of taking a base in terms of what we know, and kind of projecting what the potential entire size is, but most of those figures are very accurate and can be proven with a number of different tools which I can supply.
But what is the unemployment figure then? If you take all of that into account, which the Stats SA clearly isn't, what is the number, and should we be worried about it?
I'm saying it's closer to 15%, which is still unacceptable. And I'm really using that as a base of when I did the more accurate calculations was around 10 to 12%. And I'd just like to read you something I'm just going to pull up on my screen here. You've interviewed David Hurwitz from Transaction Capital a couple of times. In May 2021, they released their results. And so this was a couple of months ago, and I'll just read it very quickly because it's very pertinent to this. Hurwitz points out that unemployment in South Africa is at historically high levels. In addition, employee earnings growth in the formal sector has been below inflation. Despite this, around 1/3 of consumers making monthly repayments on their debt via TCRS are not formally employed, reflecting some resilience in South Africa's informal sector. Now, David, and they're not thumb-sucking that. And these are a couple of billion rands worth of debt they're talking about. 1/3 of their customers making regular monthly repayments are unemployed. How's that possible if they're unemployed? So there's another indicator to highlight. The figures of unemployment are not reflecting people who do not have a form of income or a job. And I quoted a lady who sells 6,000 vetkoek every single day for R1 each in downtown Joburg. She does it 6 days a week. And I quoted her, I asked her, I said, do you have a job? And she said in Zulu, "Ngiyasebenza anginamsebenzi," which is a play on words. She said, I work, but I do not have a job. And that perfectly encapsulated for me how people reflect this. The other thing, Alec, we need to, so in essence, she's saying, I work, I don't have a job. And she's making that distinction between being employed and being an income generator or a micro business. So I guess if 6,000 Rand a day is not a micro business, but just that illustrates it. The other thing that we don't measure in the figures, which is quite important, is that many of the people, for instance, who earn social grants will have multiple incomes. So, I might earn a social grant of, say I earn 440 Rand a month per child. I've got 2 children. Let's round it off and call it 1,000 Rand. Plus, I rent out 2 back rooms for 900 Rand each. That's another 1,800 Rand. Plus, then I sell vegetables on the street corner, and the average around hawker will make about 2,500 Rand profit a month. So that person who we define as a social grant recipient who's unemployed but earning, call it 900 Rand a month, could potentially be earning up to 5,000, and in many cases I've written about earning a substantial amount more. So again, in our unemployment figures, as person, if I go and I ask a social grant recipient, say, hello, ma'am, are you employed? She says, no, I earn a social grant. I then end my questioning there. I don't say, do you do anything else apart from earn a social grant? Do you sit at home and look after your kids? Oh, no, she says, well, actually, what I also do is I sell vegetables. Oh, and anything else? Yes, well, I rent a back room. And we do not measure this. And I mean, the gig economy is a good example worldwide, is that we have to define what a job is differently and what an income is. And we don't measure it that way. We have a society that considers a job as a pay slip and so on. So there are a number of factors. And the problem with this is, first of all, it puts us all in a deep, dark depression, which is not necessary. And second of all, we start looking at interventions wrongly. We don't look at interventions that support this informal sector or these people who have multiple jobs and so on and so forth. So when we look at solutions for this huge unemployment issue, we define what a job is wrong, and then we define what the solution is wrong, and this is this massive kind of a wheel we stuck in. But if you're in Nigeria, of course, you would measure employment differently, because only 4% of the economy is formal economy, so they measure it differently.
How did they do it? And it's very important, the interventions that you mentioned there, because our government is now trying to go back 100 years to the the whole Hoover plan, the massive employment of unemployed people who were building infrastructure. Be interesting to know whether they're going to get much of a take up there. If the informal economy is as big as it is, why would you want to go and work building a road if you're doing quite okay, perhaps with your own panel beating shop that nobody knows about, etc. But how do they do it in other countries, Gigi? How does Nigeria measure things? How does, for instance, Brazil, which is also a big third world economy, are they looking at things in a different way to Stats SA?
Look, I couldn't comment about South America or Brazil, but I believe they would be looking at it differently. I looked at, in my books, other countries in Africa and how they define it. And Nigeria, as an example, is exactly that, is that they are measuring it differently. They, for instance, looking at number of traders in a marketplace as opposed to going and asking people how many are employed. They're measuring number of tuk-tuks and so on. So they are looking at differently. And as you know, I mean, recently the Nigerians reevaluated how they calculated GDP. And I see this morning the South Africans have now decided that they're recalculating how GDP is calculated. And oops, our GDP has suddenly increased by 9% or something like that. So I mean, it just puts an absurdity to it. It's like with okay, let's just measure it slightly differently. And this is my point about unemployment, is that, tomorrow they could decide to create a new category for unemployment and or employment, and suddenly the whole thing would be different. And I've questioned this a number of times, how the government defines this. I've tried to interact with the people like the small business development department and stuff like that, and it's just no real understanding, because, as you say, they want to go back to a Hoover plan and employ people building bridges and dams and stuff like that. They're not understanding a modern economy and a modern concept of micro businesses or entrepreneurs and so on. And this is the problem. In the reports that I read that said this massive new employment figure, there was a small little line in it that says the informal sector has grown, but they don't give you a percentage of it. Or informal sector employment has grown. It was like a giveaway line. And I'd love to know more about that. But if that's true, why aren't they showing us the numbers of that? They're showing us how many formal jobs have been lost. They're mentioning that there's this informal sector employment is picked up, but they leave it at that. Because why? Because they do not give a measure to someone who is doing an honest day's living and running their little business and earning an income. They give a measure by measuring how many formal jobs there are. And it's a Stalinist kind of thing of, if the workers are standing in lines at the factory, then we've got jobs. And if they're not, they're not, and that's a lot of our problem. And to what I said earlier, if you don't recognize these things, then you're not going to create solutions for them or legislate for them, whether you're a municipality with bylaws or a government creating macro policy.
It all intuitively, what you're saying just makes so much sense, because if you think about it, if our true unemployment, so those people who don't have jobs and those who have given up looking for jobs, is the 45% which government is telling us, then you would have many thousands of people standing at the robots. Most of the people at the robots, and I tend to ask them before I give them a little bit of help, are not from South Africa, which is interestingly enough. Most of them are actually from up north, from Zimbabwe primarily. Yeah. And you would have many more of the plumbers and the painters and the people who one would see in the cities and in the suburban areas. There would be a huge increase in the number who are standing there if unemployment has gone up by this much, and yet doesn't happen. Hasn't happened. So almost intuitively, there's a feeling that, well, where are all these unemployed people? Where are they sitting? Are they sitting in shacks somewhere, just whiling away the time watching DSTV, which seems to be in every shack one drives past? So you'd wonder why Pretoria isn't getting out there and going and having a look at the things that they're telling us, which, as you say, may well not be true.
Alec, the number of times I drive around townships with clients and so on, and I say to them, all right, I want you to just show me how many people are sitting around unemployed, sitting looking forlorn on the street corner. You'll find them outside Builder's Warehouse, but you won't find them in a township because everyone is hustling. And we've seen a dramatic growth of this. I mean, I've finished doing some work, consultancy with one of the big banks, around low-end business products and personal products, and one of the things that we saw was this really big growth of hustling, is what people called hustling. And people talk about legal hustling and illegal hustling, but the legal hustling, this thing of going out and in Zulu panda, to literally scratch, like a chicken scratches around and whatever, trying this kind of thing. It's actually it grown a real recognition and admiration within the kind of broadly township economy and space. And in fact, many of the people said 9-to-5ers have a lot less money than us hustlers.
They don't pay too much tax.
Among other things, yeah, absolutely. So the point is that there's this growing kind of thing. There's a lot of it happening out there. There's very, very few people that you go and you say, all right, so you're unemployed, you're just sitting at home, am I right? And you talk about shack settlements and stuff. Just if you look at the figures, SA General Household Survey 2019, which is a really amazing tool that very few people look at. Just if you look at that, I say to people, what's the percentage of households that live in informal dwellings? And I get these figures from very informed senior business people saying 60-80% and so on, because they fly into Cape Town and look down on a couple of rows of shacks. And the real number is 12%. So 12% of our population live in informal dwellings. The vast proportion of our population live in formal dwellings. These are brick and tile or corrugated iron kind of homes. Those houses have not been built by the government. The government has built a number of RTP houses, but people have actually built those, and they've built them using cash. And if you look at numbers, for instance, of people like Cashbuild, look at Cashbuild's figures, look at Build It, look at those construction, those call it hardware businesses or building supplies businesses that are primarily in township or periphery of township environments. They've done incredibly well. And there's this transformation of townships into suburbs and this amazing growth of houses. Into really fancy houses wherever you go in the townships, and there's a complete transformation of townships. Now, how does that happen? That hasn't happened through social grants. You don't buy a bag of cement on a 440 rand child grant and then still buy food. The reality is that is money that's being generated. The other thing that you can do is a simple exercise. I saw a while ago, Mike Schussler did an exercise where he compared PAYE receipts versus applications for credit. And the applications for credit showed a substantial higher amount of income than the PAYE payments. But put that aside, no one has, I don't think anyone's done an exercise of saying, look, what is the turnover of our retail sector and so on versus income generated by formal sector income. And I can guarantee you, whether you added social grants and formal sector income and then looked at the turnover of everyone from Cashbuild to ShopRite, you'll find there's a substantial amount of more money being spent than theoretically is being earned. And this would, again, add to what I'm saying. And none of the guys, the ShopRites driving further and deeper into townships, the malls and so on, deeper and deeper into that space, are they experiencing dramatic reductions because of unemployment? I mean, if unemployment goes from say, 25% to 35%, theoretically, you would see a 10% decline on spend, or certainly some sort of parallel kind of decline in spend. And if that's not happening, then where are people getting the money from? It's not cash in transit heists.
Don't be so sure. but we're on our way. Add it to the mix. We're on our way next week to the Drakensberg, to the BizNews conference, and it's such a pity that we aren't able to bring any more people in, because I'm sure there'll be a lot of interest in the presentation you're giving. But on that road where you go past Sterkfontein Dam, there are quite a few settlements along there. And when you just open your eyes and observe how some seriously good looking houses have been built along there, again, it's in the rural areas. It is funded somehow, and certainly not being funded on the social grants. But putting all of that together, so we've got this economy that no one is measuring, or is not being properly measured. Then you have a look at South Africa as a whole, and you've got your finger on these pulses. You've always remained fairly optimistic about the country. Are you still in that frame of mind?
Yeah, Alec, I'm even more so. I mean, even and I'll talk to some of this at the conference. But even the unrest indicated, if you looked at, for instance, people like in Diepsloot, Diepsloot, the morning after the local mall was looted, the local community were going door to door and pulling out the looters and handing them over to the police, and Diepsloot's a low economy area and so on, so there's a real positivity in terms of, if you look at the right side of the storylines. Of course, they don't bear, if it doesn't bleed, if it bleeds, it leads, and also the resilience of the informal sector, despite lockdowns, despite social unrest, despite these theoretically massive unemployment figures, is just, just keeps on. And there, David Hurwitz mentioned it. I'll show some other people who've speaking about this. The reality is that the vast proportion of our population, particularly within this kind of Kasinomic sector that I talk about, actually are carrying on with their lives, are incredibly optimistic, are living happy suburban middle-class lives, drinking at the tavern when there's lockdown, and so on. And
not paying attention to the rules. Is that what you're telling me? That the rules are for other people, not for us?
Well, what I've said is that the lockdowns made the people in the formal sector suddenly meet the informal sector and engage in it when they needed their ciggies and so on. They discovered the informal sector. And some of them started trading in the informal sector. But I mean, the thing is that there really is a palpable difference in the optimism and the energy that I engage with, and I see and I feel when I'm in these spaces, and it is not misery and doom and gloom, and this middle class sector, both formally and informally employed, what I call Gasipolitans. These are people who are very modern, sophisticated people, but very rooted in the township space as a residential space. Are really the hope for our country in all sorts of ways, and they continue. They're not leaving, and neither am I. I get energized by that. I live in Kailami in Johannesburg, and many of my friends, are like, oh, how do you carry on, and don't you get depressed when you go to the township? And the opposite, I come to the suburbs, to the mink and manure set, and I get more depressed because there's less hope and energy. So that part of our society is a very dynamic one, and it's not a poor one. I mean, there is poverty in our country, but Alec, poverty in our country, real poverty, where people don't eat or don't eat enough, is in my mind closer to 5 to 10% of our population, reflective of those informal dwellings. The vast majority of our society is not in that space, and that vast proportion of our society is quite honestly carrying on with life, having a relatively happy life, in fact, many ways a very happy life, and that for me is the hope of this, and that's the mainstay of our society. It's the majority of our society in numbers, and it represents massive opportunity also for businesses who look differently at that space, and particularly in reciprocal business models where they're not only just extracting as in selling something to those spaces, but where they're helping build those businesses as well as building their own businesses.